Welcome, everybody. My name is Naturalist David Mizejewski with the National Wildlife Federation, and this is our live stream series called Recovering America's Wildlife, Stories from the Field, where I have conversations with boots on the ground wildlife conservationists who are doing the hard work to protect and restore America's wildlife. Really, really excited today because joining me is Lori Williams. She's a biologist with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. And I have to say, I have a little bit of jealousy because Lori works on some of my favorite kinds of animals, salamanders. So welcome, Lori.
Thank you. Thanks, Dave, for having me and the whole National Wildlife Federation crew. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I'm really, really excited to start talking about the two species that we're going to focus on, green salamanders and hellbenders, which are just like one of the most cool animals out there. Fight me, but you won't win. And so,
Yeah, no, I totally agree.
yeah. So before we dive into the specifics of those two species, just a little bit of context for everybody watching, and a couple, admin notes here. So number one, if you're watching this on the live stream, feel free to throw comments down, and we will do our best at the end to get to any questions or important comments that come through that way. This is being recorded, and so you can watch it later if you can't watch the whole thing. You'll just go to wherever you're streaming it now, and you'll be able to find the video later. And so the reason we're doing this series at the National Wildlife Federation of interviews, and by the way, you can watch all the previous ones as well, wherever you're streaming this right now. The reality is that we're in a wildlife extinction crisis on this planet. Over 1 million species globally are at risk of extinction. And it's not just happening in faraway places. It's happening right here in North America. And, 1/3 of our species here in North America or in the US are at increased risk of extinction in the coming decades. There's some 12,000 declining wildlife species in need of conservation help right here in the US that wildlife biologists have identified. And so it's really important to do the work. And that's what the National Wildlife Federation is here doing. That's what the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission is all about. So that's a little bit of the context about what this is all about. So with that said, Lori, why don't you just introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself and like how you ended up with this really amazing job as a wildlife biologist, and a little bit about the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Dave. I've been a wildlife diversity biologist in our wildlife diversity program here with North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission for almost 20 years, 19 years this year. And we're celebrating our 75th anniversary as a wildlife agency. And of course, conservation of all species, game and non-game, and their habitats is a big mission of ours, as well as outreach to the public, recreational opportunities around hunting and fishing and shooting sports. All of that is really our mission in many ways. And yeah, I was very fortunate to get this job, like I said, 19 years ago. I probably had the same background that a lot of people in this field have. I grew up playing outdoors and playing in the woods and the creek and, catching frogs and crayfish and salamanders and you name it. And yeah. And a lot of people have that story. And I would add that, in the 70s and 80s, early 80s, when I was growing up, there weren't a lot of distractions. So yeah, just lots of times outdoors. And I knew early on that I had a really deep connection with animals and nature, but I didn't put that into practice until much later in my life. And it was really my late 20s, after lots of other school and kind of soul searching, that I got back to those roots and really started appreciating, what is my true purpose, what I need to be doing. And I went back to those roots and those early connections with wildlife and nature. And I look back now, and there's lots of stepping stones along the way that got me here, really defined moments, people that I worked for, people that I met, experiences. And I would say just really good timing. When I was coming out of grad school in the early 2000s, that was when state wildlife grants were really first coming onto the scene. And a lot of states use those funds in different ways, but North Carolina was one that wanted to increase field capacity and add biologists to the team. So the timing was perfect for me to come out of grad school and be able to get in this job. And it was my dream job on day one, and it still is.
That's amazing. I thank you for sharing that. I just think it's so important to to shine a spotlight on folks like yourself. Oftentimes, you are working, behind the scenes. You
Mhm.
never get, spotlighted, and the work you're doing is the work that is saving America's wildlife. And
Mhm. Mhm.
we feel very strongly here at the National Wildlife Federation that you and folks like yourself on the state level should really be get a little bit of your just due for the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Can you just talk a little bit about like the state wildlife grants and what those are all about, and how, again, the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission is actually doing your work, and also if there's any connections with the North Carolina Wildlife Federation, which is of course the National Wildlife Federation state affiliate, if there's any
Mhm.
intersection there.
Mhm. Yeah, state wildlife grants, when they came on board, like I said, about 20 years ago, they were a game changer for where we are before that. And maybe just a couple of diversity biologists that had to cover the whole state and deal with lots of species, and just few resources to handle that. So when state wildlife grants came about, that really increased our capacity to a point. And we have, I'm going to show you this, Dave. This is right here on my desk. I don't know if you can see this. You see this thick document?
Oh yeah.
This is our awesome wildlife action plan.
Uh-huh.
And, I think ours is one of the best in the country. It's very long. It's jam-packed with, big conservation objectives and goals. I think about 450 species are identified in that as priorities and species of greatest conservation need. So,
And just to
Mhm.
interrupt for 1 second, these are where that number, that 12,000 species, comes
Yeah,
from. Every state wildlife
exactly.
agency is looking at the species in their state and identifying those ones, as you just said, that are
Mhm.
declining in need of conservation help. And when you add them all up across all of the states, you end up with 12,000 species. So
It's
that's
a huge, yep.
yeah.
It's a huge need, and, we had to create this document, which, we kinda considered our blueprint for our program and our work going forward, and that was a requirement, from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in order to qualify for those grants. So, we revise that about every 10 years. The next revision is coming up in 2025. But what we really rely on, and will continue to rely on going forward, are partners, like the Wildlife Federation here in North Carolina, like many of our other NGO and land trust partners, academic partners, other agencies, volunteers. It really takes all of us, and in some ways, we're still just scratching the surface of what needs to happen.
Yeah. Well, it's a good opportunity to talk about the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. And that's kind of what this series is named after.
Mhm, mhm,
This is a piece of legislation that is being proposed right now that will greatly increase your capacity to do your work and to
mhm.
save those species. And I should mention too that those 12,000 species, that's not the species that are currently listed as endangered or threatened. These are
That's right.
species that are declining, but they're not quite at that critical endangered or threatened stage. And the whole
Mhm,
idea behind the Recovering America's Wildlife Act is to do proactive conservation using
mhm,
techniques that we know that have been proven with, say, game species, but maybe not
mhm.
applied as much to non-game species. And it's a great piece of legislation with bipartisan support, coming from existing funding. And so, if the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, passes and is fully funded, I mean, that would have a significant impact on your ability to do your job, right?
Absolutely. I mean, to be blunt, it would be a game changer. We desperately need more field capacity. We have, I don't know, around 2 dozen permanent wildlife diversity staff that are field based. And, if we're lucky, we get maybe 1 to 2 technicians, seasonal technicians every year. And it's just not enough. We have such great need for, staff at all levels, but especially in the field. So, Recovering America's Wildlife Act funds would help in that regard. And we could do so much more with it. There's so much need for habitat conservation, whether it be working with land trusts and private landowners for conservation easements, or maybe outright acquisition for conservation, or even just restoring habitats like wetlands and bogs and streams. It would really go a long way with that. And there's such huge research questions that need to be answered, really big picture questions. Even just what is the population status? What are the trends over time for a lot of these understudied species? Things that we really need outside research help to do. So these funds would help, fund those types of projects multi-year. We would be able have actually long-term planning for our program and for some of these projects with this dedicated source of funds, that we can count on year after year.
Yeah.
There's lots of other things I could list, but yeah, RAWA funds would be a game changer. Mhm.
Well, I don't know if we have the link to throw up on the screen here for where folks can find out more about Recovering America's Wildlife Act. But if not, we'll get, yeah, there you go. It's right there. So really do encourage everybody to go take a look at that and figure out how you can help support it. Let your elected officials know that this is something that's like critically important to turn turn it around for a lot of these rapidly declining species, like
Mhm.
the green salamander and the hellbender. So these are the two
Mhm.
species that we're going to be talking about in depth. Lori, tell us just big picture, a little bit about salamanders, what they are, their their kind of biology and ecology. But also, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the fact that the eastern U.S. is a biodiversity hotspot for salamanders
Mhm.
on the planet.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
tell us about salamanders and that diversity right here in the U.S.
Yeah, like you said, we're the global hotspot, and I'm proud to think of North Carolina, especially being the global hotspot, and particularly here in our mountain region in the Southern Appalachians. It's unparalleled in the world, and salamanders, are playing a really important role in the ecosystem. They eat a lot of very small food items, and then help move that energy up the food chain, you might say, because in turn, salamanders are food for a lot of things as well, including a lot of our game species. But a lot of the diversity comes from the geology and terrain here in the Appalachians. It's a very old mountain system, and there's a lot of little specialized we call niche spaces or roles that they play in the environment. And then there's, isolation of salamander species where diversification can continue. And a lot of our conservation genetics work that we do now and folks have done in recent years is really shining a light on that diversity. So we're learning about new species all the time, but yeah, they're critical. And amphibians, is one of the most imperiled taxa worldwide. Maybe as much as 40% of amphibians globally are in trouble. But besides all those natural and natural history type values they have, they can tell us a lot about environmental health. Many of them have to breathe through their skin. A lot of them are lungless, and as salamanders go and as their populations go, then we can really relate that to health of ecosystems and our habitats, and what's good for them is good for us.
Yeah, it's a
So whether we're
whole
talking about, yeah,
canary in the coal mine, which I
absolutely,
hate that phrase because well, the history of it there. But at any rate,
yeah,
yeah, the idea is that these animals are particularly sensitive to some of these environmental pollutants and
hmm
disturbance that could affect us too. And they're going to go where they go, we're going to end up going too. So
yep,
that,
exactly.
yeah. So I just explain to people the difference between a salamander and a lizard, because that's like the number one question I get as a naturalist. When I start
That's
talking about
true.
it, I want to hear how you explain it.
That's true. Yeah, I get that a lot. In fact, a lot of folks here in the Appalachians call salamanders spring lizards. So, there is some uh, misunderstanding or misconceptions about the two. But salamanders are amphibians, like frogs are amphibians, and they have moist skin and a lot of semi-permeable skin. They deposit eggs that aren't shelled like a hard shelled reptile egg. Reptiles have scaly skin. And external ears, and salamanders don't either. And they occupy a lot of different habitats. So you'll find salamanders in streams and riparian zones or streamside zones and forested coves and lots of different types of forest and habitats. And whereas a lot of reptiles can persist in really arid and dry and sandy conditions. And you think of some of the desert habitats out west, and so you can differentiate in that regard too, of just where you're at, where are you on the map and what you might be seeing. But mhm.
And I think, it's a fair. I can appreciate that people would get confused because their body shapes are very similar.
Mhm.
Sort of a
Mhm.
convergent evolution, if you will. Sort of
Mhm.
generally long bodies, long tail, four legs, a head. I get why people can get confused, but yeah, they're totally different animals, and I feel
Yep,
like the poor salamanders lose out on that confusion because everybody thinks they're lizards and they're not. So,
that's
um,
right. Mhm.
so we were just seeing some pictures of green salamanders, and this is
Mhm.
just such a cool species. Let's go like deep on green salamanders. So
Mhm.
obviously you can see where they get their name from. They have this incredible kind of green modeling color on their backs, which I'm assuming is
Mhm.
camouflage because of their.
Yeah, yeah. They're totally gorgeous. If you ever see one in person, and these are great pictures that we're looking at, but, they still don't do it justice. They're just absolutely, magnificent animals and, yeah, very well equipped to camouflage in their surroundings.
And so, what is their habitat? Where exactly do they live?
Yeah, their habitat, they are fairly specialized for rock outcrops and cliffs and some of these, large rocky features in certain landscapes. They're also arboreal. They climb trees, which is really cool, and sets the salamander apart from a lot of others. But these rock outcrops and cliff faces and these other features have to have crevice space where the salamander can crawl in and have shelter and forage and nest and drop their eggs, that sort of thing. So these crevices have to be what we call clean. They can't be clogged with debris and plant material, things like that. And what helps protect them, and make them this habitat usable and keep their microclimate where they need it to be. They need kind of cooler temperatures, humidity, some level of moisture. They need shade. So a big component of their habitat are surrounding trees, mature forest around them, even woody shrubs around them help protect those rock sites, keep those crevices clean of debris, and preserve that microclimate. But yeah, we're looking at a green salamander marching up this magnolia tree, and they can crawl right up to the upper canopy.
Wow.
And especially in the summertime, to where it might be cooler there, and they seek shelter, they forage, and then they come back down really in the fall season and get back to their rock outcrops. But
That's
yeah.
incredible. That's incredible.
Mhm.
So, what's their diet like? I'm assuming it's all sorts of smaller, small invertebrates.
That's right. Yeah, a lot of things like spiders and, crickets and snails, maybe even small slugs. Yeah, just really small things that they can get to, but yeah, definitely invertebrates.
Typical salamander fare, right?
That's right. That's right.
And I have to imagine that there's probably great foraging opportunities up in the trees because there's just so many different insects that rely on trees as habitat, themselves. So it kind of
Mhm.
makes sense that they go up there. Um,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, and you can't really see it on this tree, but a lot of trees have, tiny microhabitats on them as well, maybe knot holes or maybe loose bark that they can get under and just, hang out for many weeks or
yeah.
months on end. Mm.
So we just saw some really incredible pictures of a female green salamander with eggs, and
Mhm.
this is something that I also find so incredibly fascinating. You mentioned, well, a couple things. You mentioned lungless salamanders,
Mhm.
and you mentioned that salamanders and amphibians lay these soft-shelled eggs, and I think most people are familiar with frogs laying their eggs in water.
Mhm.
So what's going on with these photos? What is the salamander doing, and why isn't she laying her eggs in the water?
Yeah. Yeah, so, as a terrestrial salamander, they need to stay moist and, those kind of conditions, but, uh the little hatchlings, when they come out of the eggs, they're like miniature adults. They get their direct development in the eggs. So they don't come out with external gills that other salamanders do that would require them to be in water. So yeah, that hatchling there with that female, that's kind of what the hatchlings look like when they come out of the eggs. They're ready to go on day one.
And also,
They'll
like, how cute
Mhm.
is that? I mean, come on.
Yeah,
People are like, "Oh, they're
yeah.
slimy, they're icky," but no, look at how cute that little guy
They're
is.
really, really awesome, but, back to the eggs. The clutch, the nest is totally dependent on that female. If something happens to her and she can't guard that nest, also brood the nest, she will kind of work her way in and among the eggs to keep fungus from growing on them. She has, special properties in her skin and her microbiome that can help protect that nest and keep those eggs viable. But if something happens to her, if she gets predated or she just abandons that nest, those eggs are toast. They will not make it, and we see that on occasion. But yeah, she oviposits those or deposits those on the ceiling of those rock crevices, so they kind of just hang down like a chandelier. And that's really, really neat to see. And she'll start depositing eggs usually in June, and they'll hatch late August, early September, and we start seeing hatchlings out and active in just a couple of weeks after that, really.
Great. Yeah. So they don't go through that aquatic larval phase,
That's
the
right.
tadpoles, version in frogs, or,
Hmm.
a lot of salamanders do have that aquatic version with the feathery
Right.
gills. And
Hmm.
we're going to talk a little bit about that when we talk about our next salamander species, the
Hmm.
hellbender. But yeah, I just find it so fascinating that they kind of break one of the rules of being an amphibian is, laying your eggs in water, or, sort of, attributes of them. And so, but those eggs do need to remain moist because they
Hmm.
don't have
Hmm.
that outer shell. And so hence that, that habitat that you were describing there, that kind of out of the sun, kind of humid, moist,
Hmm.
under the canopy of trees is just so important, not only for the adults, but for the development of those eggs, right?
That's right. That's right. Hmm.
So I think we have a picture of the toes of a green salamander, and if we can throw that up on the screen here, talk about these really cool toes. I mean, you've already talked about how they are very active climbers, both in trees and the rock
Hmm.
crevices. So how do these toes help?
Yeah, they really are like, your four-wheel drive tires on your truck. They give great traction, great stability. These guys can climb upside down. They can climb really, really tall heights on these rock cliffs and in the upper canopies of 80 and 90 foot trees. And they're not really like suction discs like you might think of with a tree frog, but yeah, they're specialized toes, really unlike any other salamander. Some salamanders have longer toes for digging in the soil, but these have these specialized kind of square-tipped toes that allow them to be acrobats in a lot of ways. They can climb upside down and really get into some uh, unique spaces with those toes.
That's really neat. When I see things like this, I just think of, I don't know, like comic book character movies and fantasy series where they develop all these really neat characters based on real life wildlife. And so I'm like waiting for some character to come out with square toes that can like climb straight up walls or something.
Yeah, totally.
Really
That's their superpower, right?
exactly. Yeah. All right. So the bad news. What's happening with green salamanders, and what are the threats that they're facing?
Yeah, like the majority of our wildlife species and plant species too that are, deemed of conservation concern or at-risk species, a lot of it comes down to habitat loss in the form of habitat degradation, reduced habitat quality, habitat going from suitable to unsuitable. That's really the number one threat for both hellbenders and green salamanders. But other threats, illegal collection in terms of green salamanders in particular. We don't have a good, a way to quantify that, but we have pretty good evidence that it does happen. Climate change is certainly a threat. Diseases and pathogens, threat as well. But really, with green salamanders, it's opening up of that forest right around those rocks. Because the rock itself, it may be free of destruction in of the rock itself, but if you remove that canopy cover and that vegetation layer around them, um, you put a lot of sun and heat on those rocks and their crevices. It dries out. It changes that microclimate, and green salamanders and other salamanders and other species would not be able to live there anymore. But
Yeah.
yeah, so habitat alteration is as well. Mhm.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point because I think sometimes we think of, habitat destruction as, the bulldozer is completely erasing all the natural landscape and paving over it. And certainly that does happen, and that is a,
Mhm.
big source of habitat destruction. But it's not just that. A lot of times it's much more subtle.
Mhm.
Removing, like you said, some of the trees in an area could completely alter, how its ecosystem and have this ripple effect down on
Mhm.
other species like the green salamander. So that's really important. I mean, even when you think about this the small choices that we make in life that impact
Mhm.
our environment, like what we do in our own yards and garden spaces, right?
Mhm.
What you can make a big difference for some of these smaller animals by making simple choices on what to plant or what not to
Mhm.
cut down or what not to
It's
spray
true.
in the yard. These things build up in the environment, and as we talked about, salamanders in particular, because of their permeable skin, can absorb these pesticides and
Mhm.
other
Mhm.
toxins, and they're toast after that. And so
That's
it
right.
really is all connected.
Yeah, that's true, and the rock outcrops, like you said, we do get, outright obliteration of some of these habitats with, some types of development, road construction, things like that, but, in terms of private property and landowners, a lot of times these rocks are valued because they're like natural landscaping. So a lot of people really like having these rock outcrops on their property or in their yard, and, finding that balance, if we get the chance to work with a private landowner, is, encouraging them to try to keep more of the vegetation cover and tree cover around them to protect that microclimate. They can still enjoy the rock and have it, featured in their yard, but we're on their property. But when given the chance, that's one thing that we like to talk to private landowners about. How
Yeah.
we can kind of strike that balance.
Well, and a lot of it is just awareness, right? I'm sure a lot of
Hmm.
people just have no idea.
That's
And
true.
and
Hmm.
and it takes having folks like yourself be there to help spread that information and that education so that people can make
Hmm.
those right choices. We've got a
Exactly.
question that came in, so I'm just going to read it out. When do they mate? And what's the difference between a newt and a salamander?
Yeah, green salamanders can mate in early fall, but I don't know about predominantly, but the season that we're most familiar with is kind of late spring. And then I mentioned that the females will deposit those eggs in June or sometimes early July. But um, for the question of what's the difference between a salamander and a newt, I would say that all newts are salamanders, but not all salamanders are newts. So, the newt is a special guy with, more bumpy skin and has a really unique life history where it starts off aquatic, in the adult stage, and then the little guys are bright orange and they're terrestrial. And they, walk around terrestrial areas for sometimes several years and pretty much not afraid of anything. They're out in the open in the daytime because they're very distasteful, if not toxic, to predators.
Which is
And
one reason why they have that bright orange
yeah,
skin.
absolutely, yep.
It's a
So a
warning.
good
Don't eat
warning
me.
sign. That's right.
Yeah.
And then at sometime later, they'll go through metamorphosis again and kind of change back to the adult form and go back to aquatic habitats. So it's kind of a three-phased approach to their life history, and that's very unique too.
Yeah, they're fascinating little creatures too. That's the eastern red-spotted newt, and I
Hmm.
love the name for that middle stage, that juvenile
Hmm.
terrestrial stage, which is called the red eft. I don't
Hmm.
know what the etymology of that is, but it's always been one of my favorite animal names.
Yep,
Um,
yep, me too. Yeah, I love seeing those guys out, especially after a nice spring rain or a warm rain. They're everywhere and easy to pick up and interact with, and then put them back. But yeah, they're great.
yeah, yeah. So we've got another question here from Amy who says these salamanders are beautiful. What percentage of their diets might be made up of mosquitoes?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I have an answer to that. Certainly, if mosquitoes are in the rock outcrop environments or on the trees, yeah, a green salamander would certainly take advantage of that. But unlike other wildlife species like bats, they're not able to hunt in a lot of other places. But yeah, certainly if they were there on the rocks or on the trees, they would eat them.
Yeah,
Not sure
and
about the percentage though. Mhm.
right. I think probably the salamanders that have an aquatic larval phase are
Mhm.
probably more significant predators of mosquitoes, which also
Yep,
have an aquatic larval phase. And
that's right.
having in my past life working at nature centers, raising spotted salamander hatchlings in the nature center and seeing how completely voracious they are of
Mhm.
anything that moves under the water. They definitely feed on a lot of mosquito larvae. So
Yeah.
yeah, they're one piece salamanders in general, maybe not the green
Mhm.
salamander, are for sure a piece of the mosquito population
Mhm.
control army that's out there in the form of wildlife.
Absolutely. Yep. I totally agree with that.
All right, let's see. One more question that just came up. I don't know if you can answer this one, but I want to throw it out there. Can you recommend a good book for learning more about salamanders?
Mhm. One of my favorite books and my go-to source that's all beat up and tattered and pages sticking together on my bookshelf is a book by Dr. James Petrenka, 1998. Short title, Salamanders of North America. That's not the entire title, but if you look that up, you'll see it. That was really a seminal work, especially back then. Describing all the salamander species we had then, and even bringing up uh, you know most of the research that had been done on them, getting lots of good bibliography to go with those species accounts, address threats, wonderful pictures to identify salamanders. And even since that book, the taxonomy, the amount of salamanders we have now in terms of individual species has only increased. So besides that book, I would recommend a good field guide. If you wanted a book for your bookshelf, something like the Peterson's Field Guide for reptiles and amphibians would be a good one. Mhm.
Great, good recommendations. All right, so let's transition from the relatively tiny, delicate-looking green salamander to the huge, gnarly-looking giant salamander of North America, otherwise known as the hellbender. So, very, very different kind of salamander than the
Mhm.
green salamander we've been talking about. So, tell us the 101 information about hellbenders. Where do they live? What's their special ecosystem roles? What do they eat? All that
Mhm.
good stuff.
Yeah, these guys are awesome. They're definitely one of my favorites. We call them a giant salamander. A lot of people consider them the largest in North America. They can grow to 2, even sometimes 2.5 feet. I think the record specimen was about 2.5 feet. What we normally see, at least in my state, are animals that are about 2 feet long-lived, 30 to 40 years, pretty slow to mature, around 6 to 8 years before they become adults and can start breeding. And they live in fairly clean, cool, well oxygenated rivers and streams that have a lot of good rock cover, especially the flat boulders that they use for shelter and for nesting. And the key about all that rock substrate is it's got to be usable. So it can't be buried with sediment and silt. These animals have to find a way to get under these rock shelters to use them, to burrow cavities underneath. And it's good to have rocks of all sizes that are usable, unburied, in the river too, because of the different sizes of the hellbenders. So, the little guys are really, really tiny, but over the years, they grow and they need different size rocks through that life cycle.
And the reason they need those rocks to hide under is why? Is it because the streams that they live in have fairly strong currents, so they don't get swept away? Is that it?
Yeah, that could be one reason. They're also, in most populations, fairly nocturnal, so they just kind of hang out and seek shelter in the daytime. We have some good populations where the animals are really diurnal and nocturnal, so they're kind of active and maybe out, day and night. But yeah, in most cases, they're very flattened animals with flat heads, and they're meant for staying under these rock shelters, really.
Yeah, I'm glad you just mentioned the flatten thing because this photo really illustrates that
Hmm.
adaptation. When you're an animal
Hmm.
that A needs to be streamlined in the water and B
Hmm.
needs to fit under rock crevices in order to survive, you probably don't want to be, very round or,
Right.
around. Right? You want to be kind of flat. And you could see
It's
right
true.
here
Hmm.
how very flat the hellbender is. Now,
Hmm.
did you have something else to say about that? Because
Yeah,
you
yeah.
mentioned,
I was going to say that they're what we call benthic animals, hanging out on the bottom, well equipped to crawl and swim in that kind of in that environment. But going back to kind of their main one of their main roles that we appreciate is going back to your cliche, the canary in the coal mine. These guys are bioindicators. That's another kind of buzzword that you hear out there. They get, they breathe through their skin. At least 90 to 95% of their oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange is through their skin. So they're very susceptible to pollution and toxins in the water and poor water quality. And it's like we were talking about with other salamanders. If we could imagine that our lungs were on the outside of our body, think about all the hazards we would experience,
Right.
all the pollution. That's the same with these guys. So if nothing else, sometimes I get some questions from the public or from anglers or other recreationists. What are they good for? They're so ugly.
Right.
Why should I care about them? But really that message of bioindicator and water quality, people get that at least. This is our
Right.
drinking water we're talking about. This is water we fish in, that we paddle in, that we recreate in, and I don't know of anybody that wants to discount that. They see the connection in their own lives. So, and the
Yeah.
hellbenders is an ambassador for that.
Yeah, I think, and brilliantly stated. And you know what? Like, just because an animal isn't pretty to our standard, to our,
Mhm.
what we think is attractive, doesn't mean it's not important or that it's not worth saving. So,
Mhm.
and yeah, if you need to give people the sort of benefit to them, yeah, I mean, these animals are telling us if our waters that we rely on are clean.
Mhm.
So, all right, so we're looking at a great photo here of folks snorkeling. This is not
Mhm.
in the ocean. It's not on vacation. What's going on in this picture?
Yeah, we're as you said, snorkeling. Spend a lot of time face down in the river and working from downstream to upstream, so we're not causing siltation to prevent our vision. And we're kind of looking around these large rock features and possibly shining flashlights underneath to see if we can see animals or looking for animals that are out and about. And more rarely now, but we still use this method, is carefully lifting some of these large rocks to see if animals are underneath, and especially do that in brand new streams that we've never been in, where we don't have any clue if hellbenders are there. And then streams where we're doing long-term monitoring, we know they're there. We can use other methods, like what we call passive snorkeling, especially in the breeding season, where we do just kind of, yeah, we just kind of get out of the way and enjoy them from a distance. We count animals, we take underwater video. Yeah, there's a snorkeler in the background there. And I like to say we don't disturb them while they're doing their very important business, important hellbender business in that breeding season. We don't disturb habitat. We definitely don't disturb the animals. And that's, it's a short window of time, 2 3 weeks in early fall, but we get the most bang for our buck in a lot of ways with really understanding these populations and keeping track of them long term.
That's neat. And for anybody out there that is, trying to figure out what your career path is going to be, just know that if you become a wildlife biologist, you might get to snorkel with giant salamanders, and that's pretty cool to me. So that's a
Yeah,
good,
yeah,
good picture here to to get a little bit of scale to how
yeah.
big these salamanders actually are.
They can be huge. That animal at the time was, the largest one I had ever had my hands on, I'd ever caught, and she was, 2 feet, maybe a little more, and like over 3 pounds. She was just a monster, and an animal that size, we would easily say she's at least 30 years old or maybe older.
Wow.
They, they're
These are long-lived animals.
Yep, absolutely. Long lived, not as long as like a sea turtle or some of the reptiles, but for an amphibian, definitely long lived.
Yeah.
And
And then there's a
but
little juvenile
yep,
there,
just a
so
little
you can see the
juvenile.
yeah.
Yeah, that
And
animal is not quite mature, not in an adult phase, still an older juvenile.
right. And there's an even smaller one.
This guy is young of the year, or what we would call larva. You might be able to see this little external gills on the side of its neck, and it'll
Yep.
keep those for almost 2 years before it, absorbs those and starts to look more like an adult.
Right. So, okay, there's another big one.
Yep, yep. Yeah, we use a
Well,
measuring board to, actually try to get a length measurement on these animals, because again, that kind of gives us an idea of age class. And while in hand, we weigh them, we try to identify the sex, we look for any markings like old scars or wounds, any anomalies. As a big monster too.
wow.
A lot of our biggest animals are females. So I think pretty sure like 80 or 90% of the biggest ones have all been females. So
Yeah, I was gonna
yeah.
ask, like, how do you sex a hellbender? I know in a lot of amphibians, it is actually the females that are larger. It sounds like that
Mhm.
rule applies to hellbenders too.
Well, I'd say maybe indirectly, but otherwise they're identical. It may just be that at times of the year we're seeing more females than males, so maybe it's a little bit of a biased sample in that regard. But how to tell them apart? Um, you're really looking at the cloaca or the vent there on the back, the rear end of the salamander, and in the breeding season, the males kind of swell. And have like this donut feature around that cloaca. And they kind of keep that, year round, but in the breeding season, it's really, really evident. So that's one way we can tell the males from the females. And in that breeding season too, you can see the females are really kind of fat and swollen with the eggs they're carrying. So that's another way.
Got it. There's so much that I still have to talk about hellbenders. We're at probably getting close to winding down here. So all right, so we have a photo here, and
Mhm.
we're looking at teeth.
Yeah.
Talk about their teeth and what's going on there, and what the hellbenders are eating.
Yep, they are mainly eating crayfish, and you can imagine looking at that mouth right there, that they're well equipped to handle crayfish. And yeah, you see that big mouth and that kind of fleshy tongue. They feed by vacuum suction is what we call, and so they're kind of gape limited. Whatever they can fit in that big mouth is really what they're going for. And that sharp bony ridge on the top and bottom is what we would call their teeth, but not a true tooth in the sense of the word. It's a rooted
Right.
tooth, not like that, but really that bony ridge and very strong jaws. And that fleshy tongue, it's not a projectile tongue like a lot of other salamanders are, but it really just sneaks up on food and just sucks it right in. And so
Neat.
you can
Now,
imagine with crayfish on the bottom of the river that they're able to take advantage of that.
sure, yeah. So, have you ever been bitten by a hellbender?
I have, but I know enough to wear gloves, so I've been bitten
So it is
through the
powerful enough
gloves.
that
Yes, yeah.
it would hurt. Yeah.
Yeah, I have colleagues who have sustained more, ominous bites than I have, where it was bare skin.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, I've been a glove wearer from day one working with these guys. So
Well, that's smart. And I actually have a question about that, because in this photo we see that whoever is handling the animal is not wearing gloves. Is there any concern with handling an animal with such sensitive skin? I know I
mhm,
always recommend folks don't touch amphibians, because we have stuff on our hands and lotions and
mhm,
whatever.
that's
Is
right.
that a concern here?
Yeah, this picture I will say was very early on in our Hellbender project, like in the mid 2000s, and we probably weren't as careful back then as we are now. We definitely wear gloves, disposable gloves, and change them out between animals, because we are concerned with passing contaminants onto them, and as well as affecting their slime layer in terms of hellbenders or just the stress level. But who knows what we have on our skin, and we definitely do not want
Right.
to expose salamanders to that.
And that's good advice for everybody out there. If you come across, well, really, honestly, any wild animal, we don't recommend you try to pick it up or touch it or pet it, but particularly with, frogs and salamanders and other
Mhm.
amphibians with this really, really sensitive skin, definitely you don't want to do that. So you mentioned
Yeah.
sliminess, which is a perfect segue to one of my favorite kind of nicknames or alternative names for this animal, which is down at the bottom right there, the snot otter. And
Mhm.
I don't know who came up with that, but it's such a descriptive term. And in looking at some of the pictures, you can really see where it kind of got that nickname. But it's got all of these other names. I mean, as if
Mhm.
Hellbender wasn't a cool enough name. This particular animal has all these different common names. So why does it have so many different names?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It kind of depends on what region you're in, what part of the mountains you're in. Here in North Carolina, a lot of the local folks who have been here generations, their predominant name for it is water dog. That's what they call it. They don't really call it hellbender. And then all these other names kind of get tossed into the mix as well. Mud puppy, which is really a different giant aquatic salamander we have. We do have a separate beast called a mud puppy, and that name gets confused with hellbender too. And other names are more regional. Grampus is one that kind of originated in Southwest Virginia. Snot
That's
otter
like
and
a
Ol
local one.
Ola's yeah. snot otter and old lasagna sides are I'd say more recent and were probably coined by biologists or herpetologists, enthusiasts, and were picked up on in the media. And people just love those names, especially kids. Kids love the name snot otter.
Yeah, and for me, it's when in conservation, and working with biologists, we're science based, right? And
Mhm.
all of this work is really grounded in data and actual demonstrable science. And again, that's why we know these conservation tactics work. But I will say, as in my job as a naturalist, I interface with the public a lot, and it sounds like you do
Mhm.
too.
Yeah.
And you can't. Just using the scientific names of these animals in Latin isn't always the most effective way at getting people to care. And so
Mhm.
I love the fact that, at least in some cases, we're able to kind of effectively use some of these really fun names to get
Mhm.
people jazzed up. And honestly, even if it's like a funny, like gross out factor, I'm cool with that, because when people respond that way, it means they're paying attention, and they're going
Absolutely.
to be more
Mhm.
likely to remember that animal and think it's cool, even if they think it's gross, right? So, which leads me then to talking about what are the threats to the hellbender, and
Mhm.
what's going on with it, and what can people do to help it out.
Yeah, very similar to the green salamander. It really comes down to habitat, poor water quality, poor land use in watersheds, and removal of, streamside vegetation and forest cover, agricultural runoff, development, just no buffer really from the stream side to the uplands, and especially when you get into some terrain in the mountains, and probably in the valleys too, you get a lot of erosion and things washing off the land and into the water. So that's a
Right.
huge factor.
And we can
Mhm.
see great examples of that in all of these photos here. You can see the murkiness, and all of the
Yeah,
erosion and siltation that has gotten into the water, which then what happens to the hellbenders at that point? They can't see. It fills in their crevices, in the rocks, or
that's
or
right.
what?
Yeah. Yeah, it could, reduce their ability, to absorb oxygen. Some of these really polluted rivers and streams could have, lower oxygen amounts. But really, the main threat with sediment is where it falls out. It's got to fall out somewhere as it's going downriver, and over time, a lot of that silt and sediment, that very fine material, will bury those really important shelter rocks and bury the smaller rocks and the spaces between, what we call interstitial space. And that's where hellbenders of different sizes hang out, and all their food items. It's very important to all aquatic life, really, to keep those rocks clean and usable.
Right.
So
And
yes,
so it's another.
yeah. Mhm.
I was just going to say, it's another example, just like with the green salamander, that we can keep the water protected, but if we are not
Mhm.
protecting the vegetation surrounding the water,
Yeah.
that is filtering out the sediments and the pollutants, and
Mhm.
keeping the water cool with the shade of the vegetation, then
Mhm.
then the quality of the habitat still declines. So it's all pieces and parts that we
Mhm.
have to be focused on. This is a great little comparison here at the incredible diversity of
Mhm.
appearances. These are all hellbenders, and you can see the one at the top left has this reddish tinge. There's the more slate one, and there are these ones that have modeling. So these are all the same species. Are they different
Mhm.
populations, or is it just diversity within the population?
As both, each one is unique and an individual, and we can even tell individuals apart, based on really good photographs, or looking at their spot or splotch pattern, on their skin. But you can see this level of color diversity within a population, for sure, especially our healthier populations. But you can also see, this uh, variance in color across populations too. Very different watersheds and different rivers as well. But yeah, it just really speaks to another unique factor of this animal. But the top right one, I want to point out, you can see some scarring and some looks like some old wounds on that animal's head. That's actually a pretty good sign, and one that we would like to see when we're out surveying for hellbenders, because to us that's a good sign that maybe the population is breeding, because they get very active and very aggressive in the breeding season. They fight each other, they fight the dominant male with his at his nest rock. We call him the den master.
Wow.
And so there's just a lot of, aggression, a lot of fighting, and it often leaves scars and battle wounds. And sometimes, animals will lose limbs or get big chunks taken out of their tail. But anytime we see that, that's a pretty good sign. When we are surveying a river and we may find just a couple of adult hellbenders and they are pristine with none of these, indications that they might be breeding, that's more of a red flag. But, mhm.
Wow, that's interesting. I think that's kind of flips the what people would expect on its head a little bit,
Mhm,
right? That,
mhm.
oh my gosh, an animal looks injured, it must be, in trouble. But in some cases, it's actually a
Yeah,
sign that they're doing their thing and they're supposed to be
exactly.
kind of beat up and bruised and battled when they're these old, battle scarred den masters and
Mhm.
things
That's
like
right.
that.
That's right.
So, all right. Well, we are pretty much out of time. I'm not sure if we have any other questions. We'll throw that out one more time. Last chance, folks. If you're watching, throw a question for Lori in the chat there, and we'll see if we can get it up on screen. What can people do, Lori, to help
Mhm.
salamanders, both in North Carolina, but also we've got people watching all over the country and probably the world. So,
Mhm.
what are some things that they can do to get involved?
Yeah, this is a question that we, try to work with in our outreach programs. So when we're talking to the public, we're talking to landowners, talking to kids. Increasing awareness is probably the first step. Becoming more aware of just the value in this biodiversity that we have, especially with amphibians and the role that they play in the ecosystem. With salamanders in particular, I think it's a source of pride that we have so many species, especially here in North Carolina, more than anywhere. And people take interest in that, and then the questions come, okay, what can I do? Maybe you think twice before putting chemicals on your lawn, especially if you don't have a good riparian buffer to absorb and prevent a lot of that material from washing into the river. Maybe you've got some erosion problems on your property that's stream side. There are ways to address that. There's resources for stream restoration and river bank stabilization. So we try to work with landowners and the public and address their kind of specific concerns and their specific situations. But in other ways, in big picture ways, we would say, support NGOs, support land trusts, support all the groups that are out there doing this very thing, raising awareness, restoring habitats, even affecting policy. If you're politically minded, reach out to your local representatives. And, express to them that biodiversity matters. These animals matter. Their unique habitats matter, and especially aquatic habitats with the water quality connection and how that affects people directly. So those are just some of the things we can do, but I'd say increasing awareness can go
Yeah.
a long way as a first step.
I would completely agree with all of those. And, your last point there about, getting active and letting your voice be heard. That's, of course, what
Mhm.
we're hoping everyone out there watching will do. Particularly, we just saw somebody watching from the UK. Thanks for watching. But particularly Americans, we need everybody to raise their voice and let their elected officials know that we want to get the Recovering America's Wildlife Act passed. We talked about this earlier for
Mhm.
folks that maybe missed that. This is a piece of legislation that is right now kind of being debated and discussed, and we're hoping that it will pass because it's going to provide a significant amount of funding to folks like Lori and the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission to help save animals like the hellbender, like the green salamander, and like the 12,000 other American wildlife species that are rapidly declining and could use some help. So we threw a link up here.
Mhm.
Really do hope that folks will check it out and let your elected officials know that this is something that's really important. Wildlife conservation is something that we all share as Americans, and it's
Mhm.
this is our natural heritage, and it's up to us to make sure that it sticks around. And so,
Mhm.
Lori, I want to thank you again for joining us. For sharing all of your amazing photos. I'm just going to be riding a high for the rest of the day after getting to see those
Yeah.
millions of animals. And thank you for all your work that you're doing to make sure that
Mhm.
these animals have a future. It's really important work, and these animals wouldn't be here or won't be in the future without folks
Mhm.
like yourself.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I hate that our time's up. I think I could talk for hours on these
Me
species.
too. Let's do this
There's like
again.
there's like so much more I want to tell you. But
Yeah.
yeah, I appreciate it this time to bring some of these species to people's attention. And I will say also that, a big part of what we do is really reliant on our collaborators, our partners, our volunteers, students. It really takes all of us to try to get some of this conservation work done. And again, Recovering America's Wildlife Act funds would just move that ball further down the field, and help us address, this thing,
Right,
this big
exactly.
document and all of that. But yeah, I
Yeah.
really appreciate it.
Well, great. And we're going to end with just a nice little video. Before we do that, I want to give one more shout out to the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. They're the National Wildlife Federation state affiliate, and they are doing incredible work on the ground in North Carolina for anybody else out there watching. So definitely look them up. Involved in some salamander conservation efforts, as well as a lot of our efforts with the sort of garden for wildlife, some of the ideas that Lori was just talking about, not putting chemicals on your lawn or planting more native plants and dealing with erosion on your property. It all counts. So definitely check out North Carolina Wildlife Federation too. And without further ado, let's take us out with this incredible salamander video. Thanks, Lori, and thanks everyone for watching.
Thank you.